Thank you. Good evening. Let me say that again. Good evening. You know, as I was listening to Alyssa and also John, it took me back to our CEO, Tony Porter. We were at a conference, and he said if women could have ended the violence, they would have done so already. He said if women could have ended the violence, they would have done so already. So when I think about human trafficking, it's not a women's issue. It's a man's issue. As I look out into the room tonight, and I see majority of women in the room, but who we need to engage are men. When we think about the victims of human trafficking, they're majority who? Women and children. And the perpetrators of that are majority who? They are men. So we have to begin to have conversations with men. As you listen at John's presentation just a minute ago, the number of boys who are addicted to porn, who are really reaching out for help. What if someone would have had that conversation with them earlier? So our work at A Call to Men, we engage men as part of the solution. We engage men as part of the solution because if we're going to end human trafficking, we have to engage men. And so when we think about culture, who sets the culture? We the people set the culture. In my introduction, I do a lot of work with professional athletes. Just wrapped up NFL training camp. And oftentimes, I'll ask the team, what type of culture are you trying to build here? And they say, a winning culture. Who sets that? Who builds that culture? And they say, we do. We do. So if we want to build a culture of eradicating human trafficking, then we have work to do. But I want to say to the men, at a call to men, we have work to do. We've got to begin to talk about this issue, bring awareness to this issue, but also how we hold other men accountable. As I go to my next slide, well, I've got it right here. So when we think about demanding culture, please take me to the next slide. Thank you. To the next slide. As we think about demanding culture, when we think about who are being impacted, 80% of men have never purchased sex. All right? So that's about 108 million. But 20% of men have purchased sex. That's 27 million men. Okay? So that's a lot of men who purchase sex. All right? Then also when we think about too is that I think 6% of men purchase sex annually. Look at that number. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Multi-billion-dollar industry. And so that's what created demand. Look at the people who are making money off of this. And so when we think about this, as John, we were talking earlier, I was like, how many schools are you doing this porn prevention in? And he said, Rick, I'm struggling to get it in the schools. When we think about how it's impacting our kids, this should be part of our curriculum. Yes. Thank you for saying that, yes. When we think about the average age of a girl who's being trafficked, that's 14 years old. That's 14 years old. And so, men, I want to grab your hearts for a minute. Close your eyes, men, all the men in the room. What if that 14-year-old girl was your daughter? What if that 14-year-old girl was your granddaughter? What if she was your niece? What if she was your sister? Does it take that for us to get involved? To see our role in eradicating human trafficking? Men, you can open your eyes. So we have to understand what is our role for eradicating human trafficking. So we have to think about, when we think about demand and culture, where did this begin? And it's part of what we call our collective socialization as men. Take me to the next slide, please. And at A Call to Men, it's what we call the man box. And I'm going to really break the man box down tomorrow in my breakout session. But in academic terms, we call it a collective social of manhood. What society says that it means to be a man. And what we've been taught, and now whether we abide by these rules or not, all of us as men, we know the rules of the man box. But there are 3 tenets around that man box that allow men's violence against women to exist. And the first value is viewing women as less value. Viewing women as less value. And so when we think about, oftentimes when we're telling coaches, and we want boys to run faster, jump higher, whatever, we tell that boy you're playing like a what? So we teach them at a very early age that women and girls have less value than men. All right? When we think about how we tie a girl, how we value a girl as well. Think with me for a minute. Let's take 3 high school teenage boys who play on the baseball team. And I think, Alyssa, you said, no, I think it was in your video where this girl talked about, guys street calling or whatever. So let's take these 3 boys, and they're at the baseball practice, and they're walking down the street, and they see this pretty young lady. And all of a sudden, all 3 boys, 2 of the boys begin to street call her, okay? And one of the boys don't. What would those 2 boys say to the other boy who don't? Thank you. What's wrong with you? There's something wrong with you. And so they're going to shame him, and then for him not joining in on the conversation, rather than he's respectful to women. But all of a sudden is that sometimes, how many times the third boy go along to get along? So we're creating that culture of demand with less value. But now all of a sudden, you take those same 3 boys, and there's another girl walking down the street, but she's their coach's daughter. Does she treat them? Do they treat her the same way? The answer is no. Why? Because it's the coach. So she has value based on the man that she's connected to. So when do we get away from that? I do a lot of work with professional sports, as I said earlier. And one year I was doing work with Major League Soccer, and it was doing spring training. And I was at a team that was in the same city my daughter lived in. And I asked the players, I said, if you met my daughter today, would you respect her? They said, yes, Mr. Houston, we will. I said, how can you do that when I haven't put a picture on the screen? You don't know what she looks like. So in order for that to happen, for respect to take place, is that you have to respect every woman that you come in contact with. When do we create that world where all women and girls are valued and respected, rather than the man that she's connected to? So part of that whole collective socialization, one of the first tenets is less value. How do we begin to see her humanity? How do we begin to see her value? The next thing is property. The next thing is property, the property of men. How many of you have been to a wedding lately? What's one of the things when we're here, and I'm a pastor as well, so I've gotten away from it. But we used to say, who gives this woman to be married to this man? It's almost like we transferring property. How many times you hear someone say, that's my girl, that's my woman? It's almost like she's property rather than her humanity. And so when we're taught those things from a very early age, this is how we create that culture of demand. That we don't see her value, that we see her as a property, almost like I treat my cell phone. This is mine, I can do what I want to with it. That we don't see value, we just see property. And the next thing is objectification. We see her as an object. I'm going to tell on myself here in a minute, I love cheeses. The little crackers, little Cheez-Its and everything. Yeah, I love Cheez-Its. And I was watching a commercial and I said, wow, have you seen it? Where they've almost sexualized a Cheez-It commercial. And think about, I remember beer commercials, tool commercials were how we objectify women. Think about some of the music videos that we're watching now, the objectification of women. And see, when we see the objectification of women, this is how we create that culture of demand. Because now we don't see her humanity. All we see is a sexual object. All right? So when we look at those 3 things, that's the fertile ground. I'm a farm boy, all right? I grew up in Duplin County. I'm a farm boy. So that produces the fertile ground that allows men's violence against women to exist. As we talk about tonight, human trafficking. So in order to eradicate this, then we've got to go back and have conversation. We've got to begin to engage boys at a very, very early age, as you were talking with porn. We've got to begin to have those tough conversations. What is healthy manhood? What is healthy manhood? How do we see value in women and girls? How do we see them not as our property? How do we see them not as sexual objects? Because this is how we eradicate men's violence against women and girls. Take me to the next slide. See, all of these things equals demand. All of these things, this is what created demand. So if we deconstruct that, begin to have conversations around that, then that's how we reduce demand. And I'm not going to say reduce demand, how we eradicate it altogether, because I don't want to reduce human trafficking. My job is to eradicate human trafficking. Before I started working with a national nonprofit, I used to do prevention work for the domestic violence shelter there in Wilmington, and I was a prevention specialist. And most of the time, I was the last one to introduce, and I said, it's my job to put them out of work so that they don't have a job. So how do we get to the place where we eradicate demand altogether, so we eradicate human trafficking? All right? One of the next things as we go to the next slide is, here's a pyramid. And on this pyramid, there's the only thing that's in the right order. This is not a hierarchy or anything. The only thing that's in the right order is that foundation, that collective socialization of manhood. If we begin to eradicate those three tenets that I just talked about, that's how we crumble this pyramid. This is how we eradicate all forms of violence against women and girls, whether it's human trafficking, whether it's domestic violence, sexual violence. This is how we eradicate that. Date rape, teen violence, teen dating violence. This is how we eradicate that. But one of the things that John just talked about is porn. You know, porn is part of that pyramid, because you just saw on the video at the age that kids begin to watch porn. Think about average age. I think it was like around 11 years old, 11, 12 years old. So when we say average age, that means some may have started watching as early as 5 or 6 years old. How early do we give kids cell phones now? Yeah. What do they have access to on those cell phones? The internet. Are we monitoring them 24 hours a day on their cell phones? No. And so this is why it's so important to have these conversations. This is why it's so important for John's curriculum to be available in school, so someone is having these conversations. This is why it's so important that here in the faith community, we began, to have these conversations. Alyssa, you pulled up scripture to go along with everything that you talked about. So everything that we're dealing with, I think it was Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun. Okay? And so really here in the faith community, we have work to do. We're Jesus' hands and feet here on the earth, so this is part of our ministry. Okay? And so as we think about porn, let me go to the next slide. When we think about porn, we think about the average age of a boy impacted by porn. And the next thing of it is that if no one has a conversation with him about porn, that porn is very stimulating. So the porn that he started watching at 11 years old is not the same porn he's watching at 16. Because now it's going to take more and more and more. And so now he's watching porn that's more violent. The porn that's more, gives more hatred toward women, that causes him to hate women, because of him to be very misogynistic, for him to see women as property, him to see women as objects. And then this is what creates that demand. This is why it's so important to begin to have those conversations with boys at that very early age. When we think about media, and I'm going to talk about media tomorrow as well, when we talk about demand, think about in Hollywood. I think, Alyssa, you said about Hollywood had us snowed. Used to, and I do a lot of work with college athletics now, but back in less than 20 years ago, that was a recruiting tool. When John was I'm going to use you, John, when he was a star athlete and I was trying to recruit him to go to my university, we showed him all the highlights, but also we showed him all the pretty girls and had them to show him around campus, because we used them as sexual objects to get John to come to our university. Now, those things have changed now. But when we look at those things, that's those things that have created demand. Think about fraternities. When we think about sexual assaults on college campuses, it's not when you think about it's athletics, but the fraternities are the number one culprits of sexual violence. This is why it's so important to begin to have conversations and to do prevention work. Let me say that again, prevention work on these college campuses as well. Now, we have a curriculum called Live Respect for middle and high school boys. And the reason that's so important is the first time we launched this curriculum, Scholastic helped us put the curriculum together. But the first time we launched it back in 2015, 2016, and we did a pre and post test with 300 boys, all demographics, all around the country. Private schools, charter schools, and public schools. But 81% of those boys in the pretest admitted not knowing what consent was. 81% not knowing what consent was. Let me ask y'all a question. These boys, where do they go when they leave high school? Where do they go? They go to college, right? Do we have a problem with sexual assault on college campuses? Think so. 1 in 5 will experience sexual assault on a college campus. They go to the military. Do we have a problem with sexual assault in the military? Yes, because of the culture that's being created. So this is why it's so important. Or they go here in general society. Do we have a problem? Yes. You showed the numbers with the data, and I think you're going to share some more tomorrow. And so this is why it's so important to do prevention work at a very early age, to engage our boys at a very, very early age so that we can eradicate men's violence against women and girls. One of the next things I want to talk about is, as we go to the next slide, is that when we think about media, you know, with commercials, with our music videos, some of the things that we're seeing on TV, now as the impact of the internet, all right, one of the number one things that young boys are searching for on the internet is, what is a man? And they're getting their information from the wrong place called the manosphere. And it's blaming women for everything wrong in their lives. A lot of these boys are watching the internet, and I'm not going to call any names of some of the people who put very negative messages out there. So it's out of the man box and into the manosphere. And so this is another place that's creating that culture of demand, because it also breeds a sense of entitlement. Why are you talking about that, Rick? Because this is why it's so important that when we think about our school board, that we begin to have this conversation is to do prevention work. When we have conversation with our state representatives, is that some of these prevention programs need to be in our schools. Because if we're not going to have these conversations at home, we're not going to have them here in our faith community, then we need to have them at school. These kids need this information for prevention. So our work at A Call to Men, when we think about ending men's violence against women and girls, how do we create a world where all women and girls are valued, respected, and are safe? But we do that by working with men and boys to make sure that they're loving, kind, and respectful. This is how we reduce demand. Thank you.